Friends, if everybody could please find their seats. Is anything else in your folder before we begin?
That's what he said. Only found one.
Friends, in just a few moments of Stuart F. Fabian, of blessed memory. As a gentle reminder, if anybody has a cell phone, if you could please take a moment to make sure it's on silent. Our service begins without words. Our service begins with an act called kriya. Kriya is the Hebrew word. It means to tear, similar to a word to announce. And in ancient times, what we would do when we would hear unfortunate tidings is we would tear our clothes. And a couple different explanations are given. One is that just like a clothing can be torn, you might be able to sew it back, but it's not quite the same. So too the fabric of our life. Without Stuart, our world has changed. Another concept, a more mystical idea, is that we believe in the Jewish faith that the soul is inside. It goes on. The body, the outside, is just like a piece of clothing, like a jacket, a shirt. We could change it. It might tear, but the soul continues on. So if I could ask our mourners, Vicki, Joshua, Brian, you repeat the words after me. First, we're going to say a blessing together in Hebrew, and then we're going to do a slight tear. And you can certainly help each other, or if other family members want to help. We say the words, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, dayan ha'emet. And all of us say amen. And basically the blessing is, blessed are you, ruler of the universe, the righteous judge, the judge of truth. We begin with the words of King David, the singer of Israel, the poet of Israel, the king of the ancient Israelites. I'm first going to read it in Hebrew, in the traditional wording, and then together we'll say it along. In English, it's on the inside portion of your folder. Psalm 23, as it's referred to. Mizmor LeDavid. Adonai roi lo yastar b'nai deshi yarbitzeni. Amei menuchos yinahaleni. Nafshi yeshovi v'yancheni b'ma'ag le'tzedek leman shemo. Gam ki yelech b'geitz al moves lo yara ki ato yimadi. Shiftecho mishantecho hema yinachamuni taroch lefanai shulchan neged sorai. Deshanta b'shem en rosh dikos yirvayai. Achto v'chesed yirifuni kol yimei chayai b'shavti v'veis Adonai l'orach yamim. Together, if everyone will join me, the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We read from Ecclesiastes, L'kol zman ve'es, l'kol chevet tzachas shemayim. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for planting and a time for reaping, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for embracing and a time for refraining, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for laughing and a time for weeping, a time for dancing and a time for wheeling, a time for birthing and a time for dying, a time for speaking and a time to keep silent. It's at this time that we're going to hear some words of remembrance from the family, and we're here really to show our support to Vicki, to Joshua, to Brian and Wilma, Nathan, Damion, Jamie, Julian, Nolan, and Keaton, and really everybody who had the honor and the privilege of living and knowing Stuart. So our order is going to be as follows. First, we're going to be able to hear from Vicki, followed by Joshua, then Julian, and then finally Damion.
Stu and I spent a total of 55 years together, through good times and sad, through arguments and makeups. We stayed together. He was my very best friend. I could tell him anything, including my weight, just once in a moment of weakness. But he didn't judge me. We agreed on most things, especially politics, but not on everything. For instance, it took me years to convince him that I am right about almost everything, because I am. And I say that humbly, but it's still true. Our favorite activities were walking, going to the movies on a Saturday afternoon, slow dancing, and well, you know, the last one. Stu loved music, and he loved to play music. In college, he composed some songs. Not necessarily nice songs, but they were funny. And there was one anti-war song that was pretty good. His favorite genre was rock and roll for playing on his guitar or banjo, and smooth jazz for listening and taking a nap. There was one other genre that we both loved, and that was any kind of slow dance music. Stu was a great dancer. His mother taught him the box step when he was in high school, and he taught it to me when I was a freshman in college. I loved slow dancing with him. The way Stu would hold me, it might sound cliche, but I could have stayed like that forever. People used to love to watch us dance, but I was just along for the ride. It was Stu they were watching, and I enjoyed every minute of it. We used to dance at home a lot, whether it was in the kitchen or the living room, any room where we had space to spin and dip. But once Stu started breaking bones, our dancing days were over. A few weeks before he died, I asked Stu if he remembered those times when we danced. He said yes, and that made me so happy. I will always cherish those memories. Dancing with my husband, that's what I've missed the most these past few years. And that's what I'll miss for the rest of my life.
Now there's some debate how old my dad was at the time of the story I'm going to tell. My mom says he was a freshman in high school. I'm certain he was in grade school. And unfortunately, the only person who could actually give us a definitive answer isn't saying much these days. Anyhow, it was a day of parent-teacher conferences. My dad had a knack for stumbling into mischief, which is why one of his teachers told him she was very much looking forward to meeting my dad's parents that night at conferences. And my dad looked at her and he said he wasn't even sure his parents were going to make it because they didn't really speak any English. Later that night, while my grandma was meeting with my dad's teacher, the teacher stopped in the middle of her talk with my grandma. She commented to my grandma on how well her English was and how impressed she was with the English my grandma spoke. Because English was, for my grandma, just like my grandfather, the only language that they spoke. Both of them were slightly confused for a minute, then they realized what had happened. That was my dad. He was funny. He was also athletic and what I would call a pragmatic athlete. He was on his high school football team as a freshman. He had caught a pass and was tackled. And when he got up from being tackled, he looked over and he saw the punter. And he went up to his coach and he said, I can kick farther than that. And when my dad told me the story, I asked him, was it true? Could you? And he said, to be honest, I had never kicked the ball at that point in my life. I had no idea that nobody was trying to tackle the punter, and that looked good to me. As a member of his high school baseball team, his coach once called him over to yell at him. See, all the players, when we left the dugout, they ran out to their positions. But my dad slow walked it. And the coach said, what makes you think you can walk to your position when everybody else is running out? And my dad looked at him matter-of-factly and he said, well, the pitcher walks, and I'm pretty sure we can't start until he's ready. Again, pragmatic. But the one sport where my dad truly excelled was a sport where Jews rarely ever venture, much less have any success: bowling. His talent was truly remarkable at an obvious age. When he was in just his early teens, he was already an elite bowler. And maybe it was something about growing up in Oak Park at a time when the Chicago Mafia was in its heyday. Tony Accardo, who ran the show back then, lived not far from my grandparents, and my dad actually would shovel snow from his driveway during the winters. But hustling and scams at that time weren't uncommon, and maybe that's why my grandfather would take my dad to the bowling alley, where my dad would hustle bowlers for money. My dad would walk up to guys in their 20s and 30s asking if they wanted to bowl for cash. Given the opportunity to take some money off this scrawny little teenager, no one ever passed. My grandfather would sit in the back of the bowling alley in the shadows, and he would flash hand signals to my dad. $10, $20, $30, that's how much you can bet. And my dad, he just never lost. And so at one point, my grandfather had to explain to my dad the art of the hustle. And we sat him down and he said, listen, if you win every time, nobody is going to play you. So you have to throw a game from time to time. Don't worry about the losses, I'll cover those, we'll make more in the end. Again, a pragmatic athlete. His skills just got better as he got older, and actually just, I think exactly 1 month before I was born, he threw a perfect 300 game. And when I was young, he would sometimes take me to his bowling league with him. And there's something to be said about the combination of 30-year-old Jewish men, cigarette smoke, beer in a bowling alley that just never goes away. I'm actually surprised there isn't a candle for that. My dad's athleticism didn't come from his dad, actually. It came from his mom. My grandmother was an amazing athlete. She was an archer. She was a strong basketball player, but her best sport was baseball. She actually played professional baseball, think a league of their own. And that athleticism was then passed on to my dad, to me and my brother, and came to a screeching halt when Jamie was born. I'm sorry, sweets, I love you. You're so pretty. My dad's sense of humor also came from his mom, and it would be a defining characteristic we all share. I don't think anyone would debate my family has seen its share of not so great days. And just a day or so after my paralysis, I had fallen asleep and taken a nap. When I woke up, my dad was standing there, and he said to me, "Can you feel that?" And I said, "Can I feel what?" And he said, "Well, you were asleep. I tied your legs in a knot. I just wanted to see if I could do it and if you'd notice it." That was my dad. During another hospital stay, because that's how I spent a lot of my time, a part of the pediatric wing had been dedicated to eating disorders. One day, my dad looked at me completely out of the blue, and he said, "What do you think would happen if one night we went to all the rooms and we replaced the mirrors with carnival mirrors?" Nobody was off limits to my dad. And it wasn't just his sense of humor or athleticism that defined him. He was also a walking contradiction at times. As many of you know, I work in finance, I trade. In particular, I trade options. And when I tried to get my dad involved in that, he said it was too risky. He couldn't do that. Never mind the fact that from the mid-90s until just a few years ago, he made his living playing professional blackjack. He wasn't a card counter, but somehow, in a game where the odds are never in your favor, he managed to win a lot more than he ever lost. Pit bosses and dealers at Rivers knew him. He was the guy that would get up after winning 50 or $100. He became something of a legend. Other people at tables would say, "You're the guy," because he would get up and leave so quickly. My dad was creative too, and sometimes his creativity and humor combined to create something genius. If you ever visited my parents' house in the 80s or early 90s, you probably had a chance to see my dad's foray into earmuffs, guys, earmuffs. Adult films. Not like that. Not like that, no. Using Star Wars action figures and the video camera. My dad placed the action figures in what we'll refer to as a compromising position. He pressed record, he pressed pause, he repositioned. And while that particular genre isn't known for its dialogue, when some was absolutely necessary, he used Scrabble tiles to spell out words like you would in a silent film. And on a side note, this is why I will never play Scrabble with my parents. I have so many memories of my dad, from the time he dressed up as a clown at our neighbor's house for my second birthday, wearing a mask with one of those frozen clown smiles. Then he walked into our house and scared the absolute shit out of every kid that was in the house. Coincidentally, it was around that time that my irrational fear of being murdered by a clown wielding a knife began. There was another time, again, I was in the hospital laying in my bed and my dad was sitting in my wheelchair. He was doing wheelies. He knew how to do that. And when the nurse walked in, she told him to be careful. Don't hurt yourself. My dad kind of chuckled and said, "Listen, I've been doing this for a while. I'm pretty sure I know what I'm doing." And the universe, having the sense of humor that it has, picked that exact moment to flip my dad over backwards, and he hit his head on the windowsill behind him, and the nurse had to call a doctor to check my dad for a concussion. And while I loved his sense of humor, one of the things I enjoyed most about my dad was seeing him as a grandpa, seeing him as Papa. My dad knew how to handle boys since he had two of his own. But when Jamie was born, I think we were all a bit thrown because this was uncharted waters. But he flourished in the role. And when Nolan and Keaton came around, he was a pro. And while my dad was never great at expressing emotions, I so clearly remember times when he told me how much he loved Nathan and who he had become. Or how when Damion and Julian joined our families with Wilma, that it seemed perfect, it seemed right. There were also the life lessons that my dad would pass on to me about what kind of a brother and a son he wanted me to be. See, the relationship between my dad and my brother was complicated at times. The biggest problem being they are so damn alike. It's like opposing magnets. And Dad worried you'd make mistakes like he made. He never told me what they were. I didn't ask. But he loved you, Brian. He loved you so much. Because he would call and tell me about your soccer games when you were in high school. He would ask me to invite you down to visit me in college. We would talk about your professional success. We would talk about what a giant pain in the ass you can be. And I got the sense that those were the mistakes he was worried about. And while we may have had different experiences with him, I have zero doubt, absolutely zero doubt as to how much he loved you. But the biggest love of my dad's life was the nearly 53 years of marriage he had with my mom, which coincidentally is more than all of my marriages combined. Quick shout out to all the ex-wives in the crowd. So one of the things I loved most about my parents was their marriage. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't always easy, but they genuinely complemented one another. They brought out the best in the other person. Whether they were being affectionate, weird, funny, serious, they just fit one another. Neither one of them always said or did the right thing, but you could tell they always understood that whatever was being said or done was coming from the right place. And there was never any doubt they were each other's priority. Growing up on Saturday nights, that was date night for Mom and Dad. And every Saturday they'd get dressed up to go out. Now my mom would make the plans for Saturday nights, and despite making those plans well in advance and knowing exactly where they needed to be when and exactly what time they needed to leave the house, she was never ready on time. So my dad would come down the stairs ahead of her and he would do two things. First, he would give me money with the words, "I expect change." And he'd usually leave me with $30. $30 so Brian and I could order dinner. Brian would insist we order Domino's and watch Golden Girls. And then after we ate, he would insist somebody was trying to break in the house and we needed to call the police. And you chose to let me speak. Okay, it's my story now. Because it was Domino's, there was always change. But on occasion, my dad would only have 20s. And so he'd have to leave me $40. And there was an extra emphasis those nights on "I expect change." But with $40, I could afford to order the expensive hamburgers from the nice place. You know, the burgers, they come in a box, not wrapped in paper. And so that's what we would do. And there was no change. And then I would explain to my dad, because he would get mad. I said, "Listen, Dad, you give me $30 and I give you change all the time. Maybe once every 8 weeks you leave me with 40 and there's no change. The way I see it, you're still coming out ahead on all of this." And he looks at me, and I think he was questioning if a DNA test was necessary. And he'd say, "It doesn't work like that when I'm giving you the money to begin." The other thing my dad would do, he always had my mom's back. He did it in ways you didn't know about, you didn't see. At dinner, when you'd get up to get more food, or maybe answer the occasional phone call. For you guys, a phone call was on a wall and you had to go and stand there. And when he would get up, when Mom would get up, Dad would look at us and say, "Tell your mother that the food tastes good. Thank her for dinner." And well, we tended to love the food. The one we didn't like was vegetables. And so my dad would say, "It doesn't really have any taste, so if I like it, you will too." And then I would remind him, "Dad, you started smoking when you were like 3 years old. You have no taste buds. Nothing has any taste." But arguing him with things on that never went far. Every day around lunchtime, I can remember him calling Mom just to check on her. And then the first thing he would do when he got home from work He'd find my mom, usually in the kitchen, making dinner, and give her a kiss. Actually, 2 kisses. That was their thing. And like my mom said, they would often dance too. When I was at college and the Jewish holiday was approaching, my mom would call, usually 3 months in advance, because that's what she does, to let me know when I needed to be home. And I would argue with her, because religion's not my thing. But within minutes, the phone would ring again, and it would be my dad. And I would explain to him why I didn't want to come home. And he would sit there and he would listen, and he would agree with me, and then he'd tell me to do it anyhow, because it was for mom. And when he had a heart attack, just over a decade ago, there was the time that Brian and I were in the room alone with him, just before his surgery. He told us if anything were to go wrong, we needed to take care of mom. I can't tell you how many times I heard that in my life. Take care of mom. A couple other random things about my dad. He had a great mustache. That's an inside joke. He didn't know how to smoke pot from a one-hitter or a bong. Something I learned in college when I first brought home some weed. But the man was an idiot savant when it came to rolling a tight joint. And I'm proud to say I was the only kid in college I knew that when he was coming home for a weekend, his dad would ask him to pick up a 1/4 ounce. You know, I was worried about writing this. In fact, I spent a good part of the last year thinking about this because I knew time was short. And I didn't know if I'd actually have enough to say to explain just who Stuart Fabian was. But as I sat on my couch the other day wearing my dad's hoodie and writing, I realized I didn't have to worry about having enough things to say. He left me with plenty.
You guys can stand together.
So I think I met my papa probably when I was 2 or 3 years old, and I feel like he always treated the rest of his grandchildren, even though we weren't related by blood, and he meant a lot to me, and I'm just so sad he's gone, and I hope he is looking over us now, celebrating him. But thank you so much.
I only knew Papa for a short amount of time in my short life, and I could say I was thinking about it. He was pretty funny. Like, he'd be sitting, and he had a dry sense of humor like me, and very sarcastic, and just he was full of just saying things that very logical, and he was just a very interesting guy. And I just always remember going to Bubby and Papa's house, hanging out with the cousins and everybody, my mom and Brian, and everybody just sitting. Every holiday, almost every year we'd go, and yeah, he was just a good dude. He was like always the head of the table, you know. He was just yeah, that's what I remember him for. Thank you.
Friends, we're now going to recite the few final memorial prayers. The English version can be found in the inside portion of the folder. I'm going to first read it in Hebrew as best I can, using Stuart's Hebrew name, which I have here in front of me. If you're able to rise, please rise. Elim lerachamim ושייכים ברחמת רבויים. המצי מנוחה נכונה לכנפי השכינה במעלויס קדושים ותוירים גזר הקיים נזירים אס נשמע שלום פרדו בן מוישה לגזר שהלך לעולמוי בעבור שאנחנו מספלים בארץ קרוס נשמוסוי בגננו תמנוחה סבוי לכן ברחם יסתירי בססק נפוב לעולמים ויצרור בתורחיים אס נשמוסוי אדוני נחל הסוי וינוח בשלום המשכבוי ונאמר אמן. Everyone wants to join me in English. El Malei Rachamim. O God, full of compassion, Thou who dwellest on high, grant perfect rest beneath the sheltering wings of Thy presence among the holy and pure, who shine as the brightness of the firmament unto the soul of Stuart F. Fabian, who has gone unto eternity. Lord of mercy, bring him under the cover of Thy wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. Be God's possession, and may his repose be peace, and let us all say, Amen. The last prayer we're going to say together here is the Kaddish. You can find it on the back portion of your folder. The prayer is written mostly in Aramaic, with the last line being in Hebrew, and it's mostly just adjectives about the greatness of the world, the greatness of God, and the final prayer is a prayer that we all have, and that's a prayer of peace. And that's the prayer that we know Stuart represents, and it continues to represent in our lives. If you know the words, you could certainly join me. Yiskadav v'yiskadash shemei rabbah. B'yamad yivrach Yerusei, v'yamlich malchusei, b'chayechon, u'v'yom echoyon, u'b'chayelucho beis Yisrael, ba'ad Allah b'zman kariv, v'yimru amen. Yehei shmei rabba mevarach, le'olam omei omaya. Yisbarach, v'yishtabach, v'yisbar, v'yisraman, v'yisnaseh, v'yishadar, v'yishalel, v'yishalol, shemei d'kedusha brich hu. Le'ela, min kol berchasa v'shirasa, tush berchasa v'nechemasa, tamiron be'alma v'yimru amen. Yehi shlomo rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'akol Yisrael, v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'mamav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'akol Yisrael, v'yimru amen. Friends, you may be seated for a moment. This does conclude our service here at the chapel, Interment at the family plot at Westlawn Cemetery in Norridge. Upon return from the cemetery, the family will be sitting Shiva at the Fabian residence, 881 Silver Rock Lane in Buffalo Grove, following interment until 9 p.m. Tuesday and Wednesday, 2 to 5:30 and 6:30 to 9 p.m. Memorial contribution in Mr. Fabian's memory can be made to the Alzheimer's Association. Those times that information is available on the service folder you received on the way in. If you do not receive one, they're available on the way out. And for those who are watching this via live stream, that information is on the funeral home website. A funeral procession will be forming just outside our chapel in the parking lot. While in procession, please make sure your bright headlights and your hazard lights are on at all times. For additional measure of safety, please make sure you obtain an orange funeral safety sticker as well as a magnetic flag to place on the rooftop portion of your vehicle. While in procession, please refrain from using your cell phone, and as you go through intersections, try to remain as close as safety permits to the car in front of you, and please use your horn liberally. The following individuals have been the grandchildren. If I could ask everyone the grandchildren to please rise to help serve as pallbearers, and everyone who's able to rise, please rise as we escort the casket from the chapel.
Pallbearers want to follow right behind the grandchildren.
Friends, for anybody who's going in procession, we ask you to go directly to your car. If you are going to procession, you may consider using the restroom before.